Hi there, and welcome to Lecture 3 of Unit 3. So we spent a little while talking about mechanical weathering, chemical weathering, and now we're going to talk about rates of weathering. And when we say rate, we're kind of just talking about how fast things weather away or kind of get worn away by weather, which is one way to say it. So whenever you see the word rate, it's kind of like speed, right? So it's kind of how fast things happen, okay? So what is it? Well, we're going to talk about this today. The process of mechanical and chemical weathering generally work very slowly, okay? So not many rocks, not many surfaces on Earth weather away quickly overnight. That can happen when we're talking about sand or soil, in some cases like in a flash flood. But when we're talking about rocks weathering, it takes a little while. The rate at which they weather depends on the number of factors. We're going to talk about all of these in our lecture today. So what the rock is made from, rock composition, climate, and topography. Topography meaning, as we'll get to in a second, kind of the elevation of land, right? So a mountainside is different from a hill, from a plain, from a flat area. And when we increase elevation, well, some things change about the weather, air pressure, and that is going to affect the rate of weathering. So differential weathering is a process by which softer, less weather-resistant rocks wear away at a faster rate than harder, more weather-resistant rocks do. What this kind of says is this fact here, is that not all rocks weather equally, okay? Not all rocks are kind of created equal. When igneous rocks, so igneous rocks we're going to talk about soon. Igneous rocks are rocks that cool from lava. That are rich in mineral quartz are exposed on the Earth's surface. They remain unchanged, even after the surrounding sediment's been weathered away. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a second. So if you've got, a bunch of land with some igneous rocks kind of embedded in there, and let's say the rest of the rocks are like sandstone or soil or something else, right? You get wind blowing on that after a period of time. A lot of that stuff's going to be gone, except for those igneous rocks. So a lot of this stuff in here has been weathered away, except for our igneous rocks, which kind of remained intact. They remain unchanged because the chemical composition and crystal structure of quartz make quartz resistant to chemical weathering. All right, so if you've ever looked at granite and you've noticed, granite is, by the way, is an example of igneous rock, and you look at that piece of granite maybe on your countertop tonight, and you see these little kind of shiny parts to it, that's quartz, and quartz is like a crystalline solid, so it has a really strong geometric pattern. I'm going to try and draw something similar to it. Well, this is a really poor drawing of it, but it's not that amorphous kind of hodgepodge structure. It's really crystalline, meaning it's kind of a nice, neat rose if you looked at it under a powerful microscope, which means it's strong, which means it can really resist a lot of change and also resist chemical changing. We talked about in the last unit, if you expose rocks to acid, like carbonic acid, it can wear them away, especially limestone. But igneous rocks are resistant to that. So you can see here, this was maybe all, like in the last image, all kind of one kind of elevation in terms of land. But over time, the wind and perhaps the rain have swept through and they've blown all this sand away. But what's left? You're left with the more resistant rock. So what the rock's made from is the key. So we just talked about limestone. Limestone is a sedimentary rock. So in the next unit, we're going to discuss this more in detail. But a sedimentary rock is a rock made from smaller bits of rock or smaller sediments compacted together. So these contain calcite, which are weathered very rapidly. They weather rapidly because they undergo carbonation. So they kind of react with that carbonic acid and carbon dioxide that's in water or in rain, and it weathers away. Okay, so limestone is kind of what we find in caves. If you guys remember our last lecture, we looked at those limestone caves. I saw an image of that. Limestone reacts to the carbonic acid. So limestone, sedimentary rocks, weathers away quickly. Other sedimentary rocks are affected mainly by mechanical weathering processes. So that would be like your riverbed. So as the river sort of flows over an area here, right, there's all kinds of rocks in that river, and that water carries along other rocks, which knock against each other and slowly weather away the bottom of that river, the sides of that river, and the rocks in the river. That's mechanical weathering. Remember, mechanical weathering is an actual kind of physical change to the rock, an actual just a rock banging against another rock or sand and changing that way. The rates at which these rocks weather depend mostly on the material that holds the sediment grains together. So again, imagine looking at granite, okay? Granite's a good example because you can really, in a piece of granite, see the grains that make up that granite. It kind of looks like sand, like large bodies of sand. You know, there's different colors in there. You get different textures in there. But whatever holds these grains together really makes the rock either resistant to weathering or non-resistant to weathering. For example, so a rock like shale, which is a really kind of flat, fine-grained rock, and sandstone, another fine-grained rock, so that means the little grains are really small, which are not firmly cemented together, break up, become clay and sand particles. So no surprise, sandstone turns into sand, okay? That's because the little particles that make up sandstone are just really small, little loose particles. They're not large particles that are cemented together like you'd see in granite, which is more resistant to weathering. Okay, so the amount of exposure is really important. So that is how much of the rock is exposed to the elements. Exposed to wind, exposed to rain, exposed to extreme temperatures, sunlight. If it's exposed, it's going to weather differently. Okay, so we're going to call the amount of exposure surface area. So if you know from math class, surface area is kind of just this entire area here, sort of the kind of the part of the rock we can see that's exposed out from the ground. Both chemical and mechanical weathering may split rock into a number of smaller rocks. Okay, so a rock is not going to stay the same shape over time, right? Over time, it might fracture, right, into two pieces like that. It may get weathered down into smaller sediments from a river carrying it, but a rock is going to change. The part of the rock that's exposed to air, water, and other agents is called the surface area. As the rock breaks up into smaller pieces, the surface area increases. So the amount of surface area here is less than the amount of surface area here. So as we break it up into smaller pieces, there's more of that rock is exposed to the air and the sun and whatnot. All right? Most rocks on Earth's surface contain natural fractures and joints. So there's kind of natural cracks in these rocks. Some rocks, are kind of joined together in different ways here. Fractures and joints increase the surface area of a rock and allow weathering to take place more rapidly. So if you imagine like a side view of a rock here, if there's a little crack in that rock, like that, look at how rain, how different sediments can get into that little crack and increase the speed of weathering, right? So if a rock is naturally one that what we call has cleavage or has these natural kind of fault lines and cracks in it, it's going to weather quicker because that water and other chemicals can get into the rock faster and weather it faster, okay? They can also form these natural channels through which water flows. So over time, that little crack, right, we can look at it. I can erase it a little bit. That little crack can kind of widen into something larger, right? And now we have like a river basin here, which we're going to talk about soon. So that little crack can kind of get bigger and let water flow through it. In general, climates that have alternating periods of hot and cold weather allow for faster rates of weathering. So this is where climate comes into play here. So like our weather, where we go from winter to spring to summer to fall, we're in a really temperate climate that changes all the time. This changing back and forth increases weathering. So in warm, humid climates like a rainforest, chemical weathering is also fairly rapid. Let's think about that. The constant moisture is highly destructive to exposed surfaces. So if you're getting rain all the time, you're getting more water, and you're getting more water on the rocks. It's going to increase that chemical weathering we talked about, that carbonic acid breaking down the rock. The slowest rates of weathering occur in hot, dry climates, so deserts. The lack of water limits many weathering processes, such as that carbonation we talked about and ice wedging. So if there's no water, there's no ice. If there's no water, there's no breaking down of a rock due to carbonic acid or carbonation. So weathering also goes slowly in cold climates, so polar climates, up in the Arctic. That's why sometimes you can hear about these bodies being preserved for millions of years because they're kind of encased in ice. Well, they're not being weathered, right? If there's not liquid water flowing over them or sand blowing on them, there's less weathering there. So topography, I mentioned it earlier, but topography generally is changes in elevation, right? So here's a mountain, here's a valley, right? Here's a plain. So these changes in elevation change weathering because temperatures are generally colder at high elevations, so it's going to be colder up here. Ice wedging is more common at high elevations than at low elevations. Okay, so in steep slopes, which we're going to see in a second in a really nice image, such as mountainsides, weathered rock fragments are pulled downhill. So you can kind of see it just gravity pulls it down and washed out by heavy rain. So think about all that weathering. If there's like a bunch of sediment sliding down a hill, tons of weathering is taking place, right? We're getting millions of pounds of rock rubbing against one another, pushing down that slope and pulling more sediment with it, causing tons and tons of weathering. As a result of the removal of these surface rocks, new surfaces of the mountain are continually exposed to weathering. Now let's take a look at that in the next image here. So you can see this mountainside. Let's say some rain has caused some carbonation here. The rock is weathered, and now it's starting to fall down, slide down the rock. It's called mass wasting here. So now, after these rocks have slid down, we've got a new surface for that rain to hit, right? So we've got new weathering taking place, right? And that's going to lead to something we're going to talk about next lecture, which is erosion, which is the moving of those sediments. So the mountain slide and gravity along with it cause more weathering up at higher elevations along a hill or a mountain. So this image here is taken from Seneca Park. Some students who went on a field study to Seneca Park to check out some weathering and some levels of the chemicals in the Trout Lake and the Genesee River. Noticed this while we were hiking. So here you can see a pretty steep slope along the side of this creek here, all right? And the water, as it's carving out a path along this kind of just loose soil here, is pulling a little bit of this soil with it as it goes down this little mini waterfall here. And as it pulls some of it away, it exposes new parts of this hillside to weathering, okay? And because it's steep, you can kind of see how steep it is there. Because it's steep, more soil and more rocks are going to fall down that and cause some of that mechanical weathering we just talked about. Okay, so humans, what do we do? How do we add to the increased rate of weathering? So mining and construction expose rock. So if we kind of use some dynamite and blast open a place to mine some salt or gold or coal or whatever it is, we open up rock to weathering. Mining also exposes rock to strong acids. Sometimes we use acids and mixed with water to kind of loosen and soften up during the mining process. So when we expose rock and other chemical compounds used in the mining process, we increase weathering. So recreational activities such as hiking or riding all-terrain vehicles can also speed up weathering by exposing new rock surfaces. So again, there's the idea of surface area coming into play. When you increase that surface area, when you increase how much rock is exposed to the elements, you increase your rate of weathering. Rock that's also disturbed or broken by human activities weathers more rapidly. Remember, when you have a rock, right, and you crack that rock, right, you cause a little break in it because, I don't know, you threw it, you smashed it with a hammer or whatever, you increase the surface area. So now that rock's going to weather faster, all right? Plants and animals also increase the rate of weathering as well. So rocks that are disturbed or broken by plants or animals also weather more rapidly, okay? So if you think back to that picture I showed you earlier, the roots of the plants are kind of loosening the soil and kind of causing more weathering because they're kind of breaking through that soil and exposing new parts of soil and rock to weathering. So burrowing animals dig holes in rock and soil, and that exposes more of it to weathering. And also some biological waste or poop of animals can cause chemical weathering as well. So you might see this along rocks. If you guys live near the lake or go to the lake, you see seagulls and cormorants and other birds poop on the rocks, kind of at the places that they roost on. Those droppings can also increase the rate of weathering as well. All right, and here's a kind of a weird example here. So if you've ever maybe seen on TV or maybe done it yourself, gone into doing some caving or some spelunking, bats live in these caves, and this is bat poop. And guano's got high concentrations of acid in them and other digestive enzymes, and that is actually causing this little fissure here in the rock here. So this little crevice is basically been weathered away by the chemical agents in bat poop. Gross. So that's an example of another way that we increase the rate of weathering. Remember, just to review, the rate of weathering, all that is, it sounds a little abstract, is just how fast the rock wears away or weathers away. Okay? How fast it weathers. So is it going to stand there for thousands and millions of years, or is it going to weather away to almost nothing after a short period of time? Depends on a lot of the factors. Go back and look at those kind of 5 categories and make sure you know them so you can be ready for a quiz. All right, hope you have a good day. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Signing off, this is Mr. Orr. Goodbye.